Welcome to Club E. Hi, I'm Rick Brimacombe of Brimacombe and Associates. I am your architect of business growth, and I'll work with you to unlock your potential and amplify the scale of your business. Today, we're discussing ESOPs, everything you need to know. But first, I want to thank our sponsors. Irish Titan is an e-commerce and web development firm. Boulay Group, CPAs and advisors. Highland Bank, a locally owned community bank. Romaine Berg, a digital marketing agency. Minnesota Sales, a sales acceleration firm, and the Network Connect, a catalytic gateway for growing your company. I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dan Markowitz. Dan is a CPA and partner at Boulay. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks, Rick. Appreciate it. As Rick said, my name's Dan Markowitz. I head up our ESOP practice at Boulay. We're a traditional CPA firm with audit and tax on the ESOP side, as well as working with companies on ESOP feasibility, as well as plan administration and ESOP repurchase obligation. I grew up 25 miles outside New York City. Today we live with my family over in Chanhassen. I have two boys, 9 and 6, and a daughter who's 2, heavy into hockey and baseball.
And then I understand with the stay-at-home order, you now are school teacher, gym teacher, and then now going off into the sports season.
Yep. School ends here in about a week, and then looks like Minnesota's getting back with hockey and baseball. So the boys are really excited to kind of get some normalcy back in their lives. So we're looking forward to it.
So what was more hard, understanding all the ins and outs of ESOPs or being a school teacher and gym teacher for the kids?
I would say the school teacher, gym teacher, because we have a wrinkle where both our boys do Spanish immersion. And so not only were we school teachers, but we were doing it in Spanish. So that had its own challenges in itself.
All right. Interesting time as well as probably fun as well.
Exactly. Yep.
All right. So as we break into today's conversation on ESOPs, I want to put it into 3 parts. First, we'll talk about ESOP feasibility. Second, ESOP transactions. And third, post-ESOP transactions. Does that make sense, Dan?
Sounds great, Rick.
Okay, great. So the first part, let's talk about ESOP feasibility. When you hear from business owners and CEOs who are considering doing an ESOP, what are they generally thinking and feeling at that moment?
Yeah, when they come to us, they may have heard about the ESOP, or some have dug into the ESOP model a little bit more, but really they're looking for a business succession plan. And so they know private equity's out there, they know the strategic buyer is out there, and somebody got a bug in their ear about ESOP. And so most times we're dispelling the rumors about ESOPs and talking about the good, and really focusing on how to make it a successful transition. So they're really coming for a typical ESOP 101 to learn more and figure out if ESOP structure would be right for their company, and what's the pros and cons versus an alternative exit strategy.
So when they do come to you, have they put a lot of thought into it, or are they generally kind of early in that process?
I would say typically they're early in that process. They may have had a friend who sold off to a private equity firm or a strategic buyer. People are a little bit more familiar with that model. They put some thought into it. They may have heard, hey, we can transfer ownership to our employees, or I can stay involved in the business. But it's really early in the process, and there's a lot of education that we do during those first couple meetings of how the ESOP model would work for that company.
And I'm sure right off the bat, those business owners are asking themselves, what types of companies with what kinds of characteristics make for a good ESOP candidate? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's a couple of characteristics. There's the financial piece, where companies typically need to have $1 million of EBITDA or plus. They need to have more than 25 employees. While you can get an ESOP done with a 50 or 60% customer concentration, we typically like more diverse customer bases. And then we also look for lower leverage companies, because in an ESOP transaction, you're likely going to put a lot of leverage on the company. So we want low leverage companies to begin with. And then there's the soft side of things. So culture, what's the culture of the company? Do they have a second management team in place if the owner is going to be exiting the business in 1 to 2 years? So Is there a group that can take over? And number three, really what I'm gauging is the owner's interest in why he's doing an ESOP and making sure he's doing it for the right reasons. If you're looking for the highest multiple, highest cash out, well, probably an ESOP's not right. But if you're looking for a fair multiple, and you're doing it for the right reasons, then an ESOP can make a lot of sense.
So from an entity perspective, what types of entities qualify to be an ESOP?
Yeah, so from an entity perspective, ESOPs is an ownership structure, so they typically will be in an S corp or a C corp. But industry-wise, professional services is a large area where we see a lot of ESOPs, manufacturing. We even see some in retail. So I think it's spread across all industries. But if you're an LLC, then you would have to convert to either an S corp or a C corp, and we help structure that piece of it to make sure it's a tax-free reorganization. But at the end of the day, it has to be an S corp or a C corp.
And what about a partial ESOP? I've heard the term, and I'm sure it comes up. But tell us a little bit about a partial ESOP.
Yeah, and I think in light of COVID-19, we're going to see more of these partial ESOPs. Earnings may be down. There might be a little bit of uncertainty around the future, what the future holds. And so a way to start the ESOP process is to do a partial or a minority ESOP. Typically, we'll see that between 10 and 40%. Most companies may try to get over that 30%. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But it's a way to dip your toe in it, make sure it's the right model. The owner still maintains control. The only thing to remember there is when you do sell your shares of your company to a partial ESOP, there's a minority discount that's associated with that sale. So there's probably a 10 to 30% reduction in the value of the shares that are sold in a minority, because the ESOP is not gaining control, where in a 100% transaction, the ESOP's gaining control. So as in any valuation, if the buying entity doesn't gain control, there's going to be a minority discount. But I really do believe that we're going to see a couple more or some more of these partial ESOPs in light of COVID, just with the uncertainty, to allow that business owner to build up the business again, maybe get back to where they were in 18 and 19 from a sales volume, and then get a bigger number at the second bite of the apple.
Has that minority discount changed much over time, or is that pretty stable?
That's pretty stable. I think that, it's kind of a valuation tool. There's no right or wrong answer. That's why I gave a broad range. It all depends on the business, the industry, the makeup of the corporate governance. So the size of the transaction, to probably the smaller the transaction, the higher the discount. The larger the percentage, the lower the discount. So overall, that's stayed relatively stable over the years.
Okay. Talk a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of being a C corp in this process.
Yeah. So if you are a C corp prior to the transaction, or you can convert to a C corp right before the transaction, there's the 1042 exchange, which is similar to 1031 in real estate. And really what you're doing is you're rolling over your cost basis in your company stock into a qualified investment, which allows you to defer the gain on the transaction. Now, there's a couple things that need to be in play. You need to have held the shares for at least 3 years. You need to be a C corp, and the ESOP has to buy at least 30% of the stock. And so previously, that's why we see that 30% watermark, because of that reason. And it's a really nice tax play and estate planning tool to roll over. And then if on date of death, if you haven't touched those funds, you get a step up in basis, and that tax disappears. And you invest those funds into qualified U.S. securities, and that's a pretty broad definition, but really looking to preserve the capital because of the deferral of the tax.
Okay. And how about an S corp? Talk a little bit about the pros and cons of doing it as an S corp.
Yeah. So typically we will see S corps at 100% ESOP. When you're 100% owned ESOP S corp, you're exempt from federal income taxes. So think about being able to plow 40% of your earnings either back into growth or acquisitions, or to pay off that seller debt, or pay off the debt from the transaction. And so that becomes pretty powerful, that they're exempt from federal. And, another piece of it is on the PPP loan, these 100% owned S Corp ESOPs are really going to get an advantage, because while the IRS says you can't deduct the expenses associated with the forgiveness as of today, these ESOP 100% owned ESOP companies don't really care, because they don't need the tax deduction. So they actually get 100% value out of the PPP loan, rather than having to pay basically tax on the forgiveness. So it's really a nice advantage to be 100% owned S Corp.
Okay. And I want to circle back before we move on to a comment you made about doing an ESOP for the right reasons.
Yeah.
Maybe just give a little bit more color on what the right reasons are and what goes through the mind of a business owner who decides to do this, even though maybe they don't maximize the sales price, but they get, like you said, a fair multiple.
Yeah, and so a couple reasons is culture. It comes down to culture of the corporation, but it's really legacy and continuity. A lot of business owners, especially here in the upper Midwest, are worried about the legacy, the continuity of their company. They built something for 50, 60, 70, 100 years, and they like the fact that they're the pillar of the community, and they don't want a private equity company to come in, restructure, and maybe move it out of town. So it's really about the legacy, the continuity. And there's opportunities to make it very favorable for the seller by the seller taking on the debt of the transaction and getting the interest, taking a below market interest rate, and then taking a warrant on the transaction to make up for that below market interest rate. So, you can get a 79% return on that debt. So it becomes really favorable. In addition, there's talk about reducing capital gains at the state level for ESOP transactions to make them more favorable. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to continuity, legacy, taking care of their employees is really what it comes down to.
Okay. Makes sense. And so again, broke today's talk into three pieces. It kind of wraps up the ESOP feasibility portion. As we shift gears and talk about the ESOP transaction itself, one of the first questions I'm sure folks ask, what are the costs associated with an ESOP transaction?
Yeah, I remind everybody that an ESOP transaction is an M&A transaction. So no matter what type of M&A transaction you do, there is going to be a cost associated. In a normal M&A, there's probably a broker involved, so you're paying the broker a percentage of the transaction. So at the end of the day, ESOP transactions probably become less expensive than a normal M&A. 100% owned ESOP run-of-the-mill transaction probably runs somewhere between 175 and 250 all in. And we'll get into the players, but like I said, I remind people at the end of the day, it is an M&A transaction. There's a lot of documentation to satisfy the Department of Labor rules. So there's costs associated with that.
Okay. And you mentioned players. So talk a little bit about the players involved, the stakeholders, who all is part of this process.
Yeah, so the board or the selling shareholder will engage an external trustee. So this could be an institutional trustee, or it could be an individual group trustee. And what they're really responsible is for looking out for the best interests of the participants. So when we get down the road of the transaction, they will negotiate the price of the stock between the selling shareholder and the ESOP trust. And that becomes really important because that's ultimately who the ESOP trustee has to report to the Department of Labor. So they need to make sure that they don't pay above fair market value for the stock. The trustee will hire a financial advisor to help them do evaluation of the company, to help them negotiate, as well as ERISA legal counsel. So they'll have three players on their side. The company will typically have ERISA legal counsel, as well as somebody like Boulay to help kind of quarterback the transaction, help them through it, do an ESOP feasibility financial modeling for the transaction, and really help keep everybody online from a timeline perspective.
Okay. And then folks might ask the question, do they really need that external trustee?
Yeah. So remember that the ESOP is a retirement plan. So the trustee of the retirement plan has fiduciary responsibility or personal liability for the transaction. So every transaction needs an external trustee. I don't think in the last 5 years we've really seen a transaction without an external trustee, and really look at that as an insurance policy, because if the DOL comes in, they're looking to the ESOP trustee and their process and their documentation. So yes, there has to be an external trustee.
Okay. And then the feds get involved. So what oversight does the Department of Labor have on ESOP transactions?
Yeah, again, ESOPs are a retirement plan. They fall under the ERISA Act of 1974. And so really they're in charge of oversight of retirement plans, which the ESOP falls in. And so basically they want to make sure that participants are not discriminated against, or they pay more than fair market value for the stock that they acquire. And that is the key. And that's why every ESOP transaction is subject to review by the Department of Labor. No means is all transactions reviewed. Only a fraction of the transactions are reviewed. But that's what their vested interest is making sure that the participants didn't pay more than fair market value for that stock. And so they ultimately have the oversight of ESOPs.
So then after that, then the next step is financing. How are ESOPs typically financed?
Yeah, it's a combination of senior debt or traditional bank debt and typically seller debt. Um, Typically, it's somewhere between 25-75 split, no more. So the senior debt will be 25%, and the seller will probably take 75%. And really, that seller debt I would look is really a form of mezzanine financing, because of it's 100% leveraged transaction. So what's really nice in a 100% transaction is, even though the senior debt may be 5 or 7 years, because the company's not paying any income taxes, that debt typically gets paid in 3.5, 4 years, and then you can reload it with additional pay off the seller another chunk off of their debt. So it's a win-win for everybody.
Talk a little bit you touched on it, but the difference between seller debt and bank debt. Maybe there's some additional pros and cons. Tell the audience a little bit more about that.
Yeah, bank debt is a typical, bank debt where there's covenants, there's collateral that has to be posted. The nice part is typically in a 100% ESOP transaction, there's no personal guarantees. So working with a banker who understands that is really important. So there's typically not personal guarantees. But it is a bank, and if things were to go south, you have the same issues that you would have with a bank. On the flip side, a seller debt is typically a group of individuals or an individual who used to own the company may still be involved in the company. It's a lot friendlier. So if you hit rough waters and you need to defer interest payments for a couple months or defer principal payments, COVID-19 is a perfect example where sellers say, you know what, I understand. I'm not going to bankrupt the company to make sure I get my payments. And I have to say, senior lenders have been really good about working with companies in this time frame. So this is not a knock, but it's a much easier conversation to do with seller finance versus bank debt.
Yeah. So speaking of seller financing, talk a little bit about why warrants are used along with seller debt.
Yeah. So the seller debt is either 100% of the transaction or up to 75%. And the reason why it's really important to have warrants is that is really mezzanine financing that probably commands a return of 7 to 9% on. But if you were to do that on top of the senior debt, it would put the company in a really tough cash flow position. So what we do is we say, okay, the seller will take an interest rate of 3 or 4%. And then what we do is we model out a warrant to really make up the difference between the below market interest rate and that 7 to 9% return that the seller deserves. And so that's one way to kind of make up that return. It is not additional purchase price. We are very clear with that because the Department of Labor would not agree with that. really it is to make up the return on the debt that they're entitled to.
Okay.
And it gives
And,
protection to the company real quick, because it is pegged to the share price. So if the company doesn't perform post-transaction, then the seller debt doesn't pay out. But if you remember, the enterprise value of the company hasn't changed, just the equity value has reduced because of the debt you've put on the books. And so as you pay down the debt, the equity value will automatically increase as long as the enterprise value stays stable or grows.
talk a little bit about the timing. So you mentioned that folks come to you, they're probably early in the process, they may not know a lot. You have an initial meeting.
Yep.
Talk a little bit about kind of how long this whole process goes from that initial meeting to actually conducting a transaction.
Yeah, I would say it's typically 4 to 6 months. Typically, we'll do that ESOP 101 presentation. We'll make sure everybody's on board. And then we'll get engaged to do an ESOP feasibility study, which will run a couple different scenarios. How much will the ESOP buy? What does the debt of the ESOP look like? Is it seller or bank? What are those models showing? What's the after-tax cash flow to the company? And so we usually takes 45 to 60 days to work through that. And then we get either a thumbs up or thumbs down on the transaction. And then it's probably a good 3 to 4 months from there to close the transaction, because you have to engage the trustee and the financial evaluation firm. And then they have to do their due diligence, and then you have an active negotiation. So I would say all in, it's 4 to 6 months. I'll say the first 2 months typically take longer to kind of get the structure of the transaction, but if you do it right then the backside of the transaction goes much quicker.
So at 4 to 6 months, typical. Let's say you could have it conducted how you want it done. How much lead time in a perfect world might you ask for in terms of other things you might work through or whatnot? So if you could describe it, how long of the timeline would you like to see?
Yeah, I think that 6-month timeline is really nice to have. It gives us some flexibility. One of the questions I always ask before we even kick off a feasibility study is, what's your date of closing look like? What's your desired date of closing? It's backward engineer from there on the front side, so there's no surprises. And sometimes it can move up a month, it can move back, but that's really a nice way to get everybody on the same page. But I like a full 6 months to kind of work through the process and make sure we do it right.
Okay, all right. I guess last question, what kinds of financial materials and how does a company get ready for when they come have that first meeting with you? What should they have prepared, or what should they be working on, stuff like that?
Yeah, so for that first meeting, as long as they have internal financials, that's a good starting point. We hope that they're audited or reviewed, but we know that's not always the case with family-owned businesses. But really what we're looking for is learning the business. Once we get the thumbs up, that's where we start working through a 5-year projection model. We really start digging in the debt capacity of the company. What does the cost structure look like post-transaction? One of the things that we work through is, what's the personal expenses that are running? We all know that business owners run different stuff. They may have kids on payroll. And we really try to get to the bottom of, what does the cost structure of the company look like post-transaction? Because that's really what we're valuing on it. We had a situation where the owner and his kids, it was a transaction that closed in 19, but he was adamant that the kids stayed on the payroll through 2020, which is fine as long as we're pretty upfront in the financial modeling. And so it just reduces the cash flow or the purchase price a little bit, but that was really important to him. So understanding what pieces are really important and how that affects the cash flow, as long as we know that, we can kind of work with the trustee or deliver an accurate financial model.
Okay. And so now at this point, they've assessed with you the feasibility. They've gone through the process of conducting the transaction. And now there's a whole new post-transaction, ESOP transaction world. Talk a little bit about corporate governance and the role of the ESOP trustee in the business going forward.
Yeah, so post-transaction, I would say most companies keep their trustee, their external trustee on an ongoing basis, because really on an ongoing basis, the big thing that that trustee is responsible for is setting the share price on an annual basis. While they hire a valuation firm to help them with the financial model, ultimately the trustee is the one who's setting the price. Now, 99% of the time, they'll take the share price that is given to them, but that's really the role of the trustee, and it becomes a fiduciary responsibility. The company is no longer paying income tax, so an additional moderate expense for an ongoing trustee makes a lot of company feel good. So the trustee is responsible for appointing the board of directors. The board of directors is responsible for appointing the trustees. So it becomes a little bit of a circular transaction. But really, the trustee's there looking for the best interest of the participants. The trustee typically doesn't meddle in the day-to-day business of the organization. They may only attend one board meeting, and really, they're trying to learn enough information to be able to do due diligence on that annual evaluation.
Okay. How about the role of the board? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so one of the things that we see is these are typically family-owned businesses that convert to an ESOP, so they've never had a formal board. So typically, we'll see a 5 to 7 person board. The selling shareholder typically has a spot on the board of directors, and they can still be the CEO of the company too, so that's okay. But what there is a push for now is independent board members. And really what that means is it could be people the CEO knows, but they can't be family. Because really what the DLL said is you've given up control of your company. And one of the ways you give up control is by board seats. So if you have a board of 5, maybe you need initially 2 independent board directors who bring something to the table. It could be somebody who from a like industry, somebody with a financial background, somebody who's been in an ESOP company. And so that becomes really important.
Okay. And then I think one of the common misconceptions about ESOPs is that post-transaction, the employees can actually dictate what happens. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so post-transaction, the ESOP trust, that plan, that ESOP trust is really the one who owns the shares, and the participants of the company have a beneficial interest in the trust, but they don't necessarily hold those shares. So they are not technically a shareholder, so they don't have the rights that a normal shareholder would. And also remember, those shares that the ESOP buys, not all those shares are allocated to participants on day one. It's not like you allocate all the value on day one. Typically, those shares are allocated over a 25 or 40-year period based on compensation. So it's kind of a slow bleed. But to answer your question, the participants have a beneficial interest in the trust. The trust is really the shareholder. And that's what the ESOP trustee is doing, is they are the shareholder or the representative for the shareholder, which is the ESOP trust.
Okay. How about the annual costs? Is it expensive to run the ESOP on an annual basis?
No, I think it depends a little bit of how you're structured. So you have an external trustee. You have probably E&O insurance that maybe you didn't have before. There's annual ESOP administration. So think about 401k. You get participant statements. You have the same thing on the ESOP side. You have the annual valuation costs. For most companies, it's 50 to 70 grand of additional costs on an ongoing basis to run the ESOP. But remember, a lot of these companies were paying $2-3 million in tax. And so to have a little bit of a cost to run the ESOP is really a huge savings. So we don't see that as a hurdle to get over.
Okay. So there are a bunch of benefits for having an ESOP. What's the best way for the company to go about communicating those to the employees?
Yeah, communication is key. What I tell my newer ESOPs is you can't over communicate. And so it's celebrating the ESOP. It's bringing in your service providers to do employee education about what does the ESOP mean. I will tell companies that it takes 2 or 3 years for the employees to start seeing the value, because those shares are bleeded in over 25 to 40-year period. So those account balances start really low and they grow over time. In addition, you put all this leverage on the company, so those initial shares are not worth a whole lot. But as you pay down that debt, that value drives right to the participant statement and the participant balance. So it's coming up with a robust communication plan, whether it be videos. One of the coolest things I saw was a company sold, and the owner put an envelope under each person's desk, chair at the meeting, and during the meeting, he said, "I sold the company," and in the envelope is who I sold it to, and in the envelope was a mirror. And so the employees pulled out a mirror and they looked into the mirror, and he said, "You are the employee owners now." And that was a pretty cool moment of a cool way to roll out an ESOP. But it's continuous promoting the ESOP. It does take 2 or 3 years for it to really garner the strength as those participant balances increase.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Ingenious, as well as driving home what the business owner was trying to accomplish. As you look back on companies that have had successful ESOPs, other than communication, are there certain other characteristics that you would say the companies that do better going forward have?
Yeah, I think it's all about the culture, right? It's getting buy-in from the culture. So a lot of times, even the logos are changed, and the name tag plates outside people's offices and cubes are changed to say, I'm an owner. And it's really getting people to buy in and saying what I do matters and what I do translates to an increased value in the stock price. We see ESOP companies become really frugal. You don't have the same expense abuse that you may have in a normal company because they know it impacts them, and each other holds people accountable. And so it may cause some people to get off the bus because they're not liking the direction, but I would say the successful ESOPs, everybody's moving in the same direction and holding each other accountable.
So if communication and culture are the two key things on making it work, what about something maybe in the ones that haven't worked as well? Any common characteristics or things that you've seen as themes running through those companies?
Yeah, early on, volatility in stock price has always been an issue. So if the company hits a decline right after post-transaction, it kind of loses the muster. There was one situation where the participants felt like the company overpaid, which they actually did. The projections used in the initial transaction were not realistic. And so that's where you get into trouble, because then you have to service this debt and it becomes really difficult. The transaction is the transaction price because the company needs to be able to service the debt. And so if the company has problems servicing the debt and can't invest in the company in the future, then it's kind of a bad transaction. But I would say 98%, 99%, they're all really good transactions. And 5 to 7 years, it's amazing where these companies have gone. Their debt is paid off, and now they have this tax savings that they're reinvesting in their company.
Yeah, well, if the seller's carrying 70% of the cost, in essence, they're not incented to sell it at a higher price, because if the company has trouble with the debt, then ultimately the transaction, it maybe doesn't fail, but it's not a good one.
Right. And then another piece of that is that seller debt is usually unsecured debt. So there's no recourse. So they're incentivized to make sure it's a good transaction. And most people come to me and say, "Hey, I want this to work for the company, but I want to work for me. There's a certain number I need," and it's usually a realistic number. And typically we get over that number. But if you want 12, 15, 20 times EBITDA, go find a private equity or strategic buyer. Typical multiple, I'll say typical in most industries, are somewhere between 4.5 and 7 in an ESOP deal. There are opportunities to get higher depending on the industry, but typically it's in that 4.5 to 7 range, depending on the size of the company, the diversity of the company, the product mix, the customer mix, those type of things.
What are some of the emotions or feelings that the business owner goes through post-transaction?
Yeah, and I'll even back up. I think as somebody who works with business owners on these transitions, don't underestimate the emotional side of the transaction. The owner is selling their probably their most significant asset they ever held, and so it is emotional. It's something that they probably built from the ground up or grown significantly over a long period of time. And so emotionally, getting over the hurdle that they no longer own the company is difficult. It can be a little contentious that first year, but typically it settles down after a year, and they realize that, you know what, there's a second management team in place. Now we have seen a lot of ESOPs here recently where the sellers are 40 something and they continue to run the CEO, and there you don't have those issues because they continue to stay involved. They have seller debt. They participate in the ESOP, so they're motivated the same way as others. But the emotional side of selling a business, no matter what business it is, don't underestimate that.
So you must have to be coach, mentor, psychiatrist.
There's a lot of ups and downs in a transaction. And I always tell people 2 weeks before, we're going to have 2 fire drills or 3 fire drills in this last 2 weeks. And they're like, no, this is going smoothly. I said, and then afterwards they said, you told me there was going to be fire drills. And so you're riding that emotional roller coaster with them, but typically we get through it, and most people are really happy after the transaction that they did it.
Okay, great. So that wraps up the post-transaction segment here that I wanted to get through. So again, as we look back on our talk today, I wanted to look at kind of the feasibility and assessment of doing an ESOP. We looked at the transaction itself, and we looked post-transaction. Any closing kind of thoughts or perspectives that you have? Any last words of wisdom that you'd like to share with our audience?
Yeah, always make sure you know what you're getting into, and do really spend the money up front to do that ESOP feasibility study and really understand what it looks like, what the transaction looks like. It will make the transaction so much easier if you decide to move forward. You don't want an ESOP trustee or a valuation firm determining the transaction for you. And so that feasibility / structuring of the transaction, that really sets the transaction up. It lets the seller be in control of the structure versus the ESOP trustee or valuation firm forcing a structure on the seller that they don't like.
Okay. And Dan, for folks to get a hold of you, I know the website is bouletgroup.com, but what's your phone number and email address?
Yeah, so it's D Markowitz, MARKOWITZ @bouletgroup.com, and my phone number is 952-841-3027.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Dan. Appreciate it, and look forward to having you again sometime soon.
Sounds great. Thanks, Rick.
Great. Thank you.